Before we share the questions and responses to what many students from the confirmation classes at different churches sent into us, we're so grateful that you took the time in advance to do that. We miss having you here where we can have a dialogue and talk back and forth and hear each other's questions and see each other's faces. Before we get to the questions that you submitted, we want to take a moment and take note of the fact of how special this weekend is for our country to celebrate the life of Martin Luther King Jr. In his famous letter from the Birmingham jail, where he, for very different reasons than we do today, sat isolated, separated, unable to be with other people, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. wrote words that are pertinent for us in this moment. He wrote, "Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be." These times when we come together as faith groups from different corners, from different perspectives, and we see each other and understand who each other are and ask questions as our guests tonight have, those are moments where you help us to be more of who we ought to be, and we pray we help you to be more of who you ought to be as we honor our differences, not as things that divide us, but rather as aspects that make us more who we are and therefore allow us to be better together. And so it's a great honor to do our best to respond to the questions that you asked. There were a number of questions about our Torah Scrolls, wonderful questions. Questions like, how old are they? Are they all the same? How many words are in the scroll? How big are they? And so I'm going to take us over to our ark. I feel a little bit like Mr. Rogers. Come over with me, and we'll open our ark. And I'll show you our many scrolls, but I'll tell you first that they're all exactly the same. Every Torah, part of what makes every Torah scroll special is that it is just like every other Torah scroll. Every word is identical from beginning to end. Sizes are different, but every word in every Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, what we call the books of Moses, often Genesis through Deuteronomy. So I'll open our ark, and Kylie's going to help by moving our camera over so that you can see the scrolls that we have and how we keep them. And then in a moment, we'll share an image of an open scroll and let you hear the sound of it being chanted. So join me over at our ark. So we keep our scrolls in an ark for a few reasons. One, it mimics the story of in our Bible of how the Torah, the story, and the commandments of the Israelites were kept in a very special place as they journeyed through the wilderness. But we also do it because we want to keep our Torah scrolls safe. The Torah is a very delicate object, and so inside each of these cases, these covers, hopefully you'll be able to see a little bit. There is a scroll inside, and inside that scroll are the Hebrew writings of those first 5 books. But we're very careful with it. You'll see in a minute in a picture when we hear Ken or Kathy chanting some of the Torah that we don't touch the Torah with our fingers because the oil from our skin will cause the ink to smear. And so we use a special tool to point at the words as we read them. And we keep them covered and protected, and we adorn them with silver so that they're beautiful and colorful, and we have this sense of joy and pride when we see our Torah scroll. And so I believe we have a picture. Normally when we have a Torah service, we take the Torah out, and we actually walk it around the room, and everybody reaches out to touch the Torah scroll. As you can see in that picture, this is during a service where we walk around and we take the Torah out and everybody stands and we sing while we carry the Torah around the room so that everybody can feel that they are personally close to the Torah and as we honor our story. I'm going to close our arc now and share some of the specifics to the questions that you asked. So, turn this one off. So, you made me do some research. I had to look up some stuff. How many words are in the Torah? I didn't know. This is the benefit of you asking your questions in advance. It turns out there's almost 80,000 words in the Torah. When we've unrolled our Torah scroll, it's gone almost from one side of this room all the way to the very back, which I know you can't see right now, but imagine you're in a large sanctuary. When the Torah is unrolled, it's very, very long. And one of the challenges of a Torah being in a scroll rather than a book is that it takes a while to get from one part to the next. So if I want to open up in this is also a Torah, but this is a book of a Torah, not the scroll. If I want to find Genesis in this book, I just open a Genesis. If I want to skip ahead to Deuteronomy, I just flip a couple hundred pages and I'm in Deuteronomy. When you put something in a scroll, you have to roll it. It takes a while. But the good news is you never have to use a bookmark, because wherever you stop reading in the scroll, that's where the scroll is left, which is also important because we read our Torah every week. This was another one of your questions, is how do you decide on the readings that you do every week? So every week, every Jewish community reads the exact same section of the Torah, and then the next week we read the very next following section. So we read the Torah in order from beginning to end, and it takes a year to read from beginning to end. There are 54 portions that we have separated the Torah into. And of course, there are 52 weeks. So there are a couple times during the year where we usually read what we call a double portion. But everybody reads the same schedule every week. In the fall, we start over with the book of Genesis, which is why right now, in the middle of winter, we're in the book of Exodus. As we move through the year, we'll keep reading and get through Leviticus and Numbers and eventually to Deuteronomy, usually around the summer and towards the end of the summer. And then we begin Genesis again in the fall. So there is a very specific way in which we read Torah. So we're going to show you now, we'll show you a video in a minute, but we're going to show you the image first so that I can describe what the inside of a Torah scroll looks like. So you're looking now, if we were to open up a scroll, you see that metal pointer there, which we call a yad, because if you look closely at it, you'll see that the end of it has a little hand on it with a finger pointing at the scroll. And yad in Hebrew means hand. So we use this yad so that we can read the words that are in the Torah. But while you're looking at that, I want you to look past the yad, and you look at how straight the columns are of those words, all written in Hebrew. And you'll notice that there are no numbers or no notes in the margin. In the Torah, there are no verses that are numerated. There's no chapters. There's actually no punctuation, and there's actually no vowels. It's much like one long text that you would send to your friend. No punctuation, no vowels, no capitals, no end of sentences. And so we have said since the very beginning of reading Torah that it's always an interpretation, because without punctuation, you actually don't know exactly what it's trying to say. You have to interpret what it's saying, which is deeply important to us. The important aspect of Torah is not that we know exactly what it says, but rather that we study it, and we spend time debating what it means so that we can take meaning for our own lives from the Torah itself. The scroll itself is made out of animal skin, and it's written with a very special quill and very special ink by a person who is specially trained, and it usually takes about a year for somebody to handwrite the Torah beginning to end. And every Torah is identical, as I shared, and they can't make any mistakes. So when they make a mistake, they have to either cut that word out. You can take a thin knife and you slice the word out of the animal skin, or they have to redo that whole section. It's a very special practice, not only to write a Torah, but also to chant the Torah. And so we're going to play this video for you now, which has the sound of Cantor Kathy chanting the words of the Torah, as you'll hear what it sounds like when the Torah is chanted during one of our worship services.
Amen. Ve'achar ba'u Moshe ve'Aharon Vayomeru el Paro, Ko Amar Adonai Elohei Yisrael, Shalach et Ami, V'yachogu li bamidbar. Vayomer Paro, Mi Adonai Asher Eshma V'kolo, L'shalach et Yisrael.
So that's what it sounds like when we read Torah. It's a very specific way of chanting that helps give some feeling to the words and acts sort of like punctuation. There was a question about music. The question was, what type of music is traditionally played or sung during worship services? And so I'm going to ask Cantor Kathy to answer that question for us, since she's our musical professional and knows much more about it than I do.
So we have several prayers that are chanted, but not in the way that you heard the Torah being chanted, because the Torah is chanted in something called trope, which are very specific, notated ways to chant specific words. The songs that you heard, the prayers that you heard that we chanted tonight were called the Chatzi Kaddish and the Amidah, our most personal prayer, where we faced east, we faced the ark, and we chanted and we bowed, and that's a different type of chanting. And those are very traditional prayers in our prayer book, and we rarely deviate from those specific melodies. However, we do have a lot of freedom because there are beautiful prayers in our liturgy, in our prayer book, and we've had many different people over the centuries to compose different ways to explain the beautiful prayers that we have in our tradition. One of the songs that you heard tonight was the Hashkivenu, and it was mostly in English. There was some Hebrew peppered in there, and that was written by a very good friend of my son, and he's a cantor in training, Josh Goldberg. So we have some up-and-coming musical artists that are composing music for our tradition that we are incorporating into our services, and then we have some music that's been composed over years and years that we still use and are considered very familiar to people, so that therefore they love those tunes, and we don't want to alter those either. And one of the prayers that you will hear after this explanation is called the Mishaberach, which is a prayer for healing. And the woman that composed that, her name is Debbie Friedman, who we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of her passing. And this particular composition has become a traditional prayer over the last several years, actually probably the last 30 years, because she's been around for a while, and it's just been embraced by congregations all over the world. So you will hear that soon.
Another question we got is, do all Jewish kids learn Hebrew? And do Jewish kids have something like confirmation? The answer to both of those is yes, sort of. Our children learn Hebrew. We do our best to teach them how to read Hebrew, and they have what is called a bar or a bat mitzvah, usually when they're around 13, where they read from the Torah, just like you heard Cantor Kathy doing a few moments ago. So they learn how to read Hebrew, but that's not easy. Hebrew is written right to left. It's different letters. It's a Semitic language. And in fact, somebody had asked they asked, why is Hebrew written in a different way? And it's very interesting. Hebrew is such an old language that originally it was chiseled into stone. And so if you imagine yourself, this is yet another reason why people who are left-handed can be angry. The world was really built for right-handed people, as we continue to hear from our lefty friends. That as you're chiseling, you chisel with your right hand. So it was hard if you went from the left to the right, as we write English, because you were actually making the letters with your left hand while you were chiseling with your right. So Hebrew was written right to left because in order to chisel from the right to the left, you wanted to use your dominant hand and be able to see the letters that you were writing. So a number of ancient languages, pictographs and languages like Hebrew were written right to left, and we continue to read them that way. So if you were using our prayer book for the first time, you noticed that what we would call in America the back of the book was actually the front of the book, because it is put together in a way that is dominant towards the Hebrew, which is written right to left. Our kids learn to read Hebrew. They don't learn how to speak Hebrew fluently, usually, unless they're exceptional with language, which is something we wish we could teach them, but there just isn't time. unfortunately. And we do have confirmation, in addition to bar and bat mitzvah, we do have confirmation, although that's something that we've borrowed from our Christian friends, as we've seen how meaningful it can be as our children become adults and as they embrace our faith and our traditions. We've included for the last couple hundred years, actually, a ceremony of confirmation that we take great pride in as they learn together, much like you do as high schoolers usually. Are there special meals for Shabbat? And is there a ritual like communion? There really is not a ritual like communion, although I would tell you that most Jewish people will tell you we have lots of special foods. We don't have many ritualized foods, meaning there aren't many foods that we utilize during a worship service. You will see that we will, at the end of our service, bless the bread, the challah, which is a special type of bread, and that we will bless the wine, which we call the Kiddush blessing. But those are not like communion in that they don't hold the same ritual importance and symbolism that communion holds often for Christian groups. And so for us, it's really the beginning of our celebratory meal. The way that we end our service is by starting the celebratory meal, which is our Shabbat meal. And at our Shabbat meal, we have a glass of wine and we have a special sweet bread to celebrate the beginning of Shabbat and having a family meal together, much like the tradition of having a Sunday night dinner that's common in the Western world or in countries where Christianity is a dominant religion. There's often a family meal on Sunday afternoon or Sunday evening. On Shabbat, on Friday night, our community has our family meal together, and we begin that meal by sharing a blessing over bread and a blessing over wine to share how special that meal is. Where do the Hebrew people come from? This is our last question, our last series of questions. And are all Jewish people from Israel? And so it's a great question. The Jewish people are incredibly diverse, even though we are incredibly small in number. So just about 15 million Jews in the world, somewhere, it fluctuates a little bit, but somewhere around 15 million Jews in the world, which is not many if you think about how large other religions are in number. And yet, Jewish people come from all over the world. And we actually have we have different ethnicities within Judaism. So some people refer to themselves as Ashkenazi Jews, which means that their families came from Eastern Europe over the last 300, 400, 500 years. And some people call themselves Sephardic Jews, which means that their families at one time were in Spain and left, many of them around the time of 1492, which is a special date in American history, but in Jewish and world history, it's also the time of the Inquisition, when Jews were expelled from Spain. And many of those Sephardic Jews moved east. Many Ashkenazi Jews moved east, but also moved west. So west from Europe is us. It's America. So many American Jews have an Ashkenazi background. Not all of them, but many. Many Jews who live in the eastern part of the world, in Israel and the Middle East, they have a Sephardic background, meaning that their families left the Spanish area and moved east. And there's also a group of Jews called Mizrahi Jews, which are Jews who have always been in the Middle East and never left. But that being said, Jewish people are living in Australia and South Africa, and many of their families have been there for many, many generations. Yes, originally we would say that in some ways, almost all people, all families who can trace their families back to being Jewish for many generations, eventually they would get back to people who lived in the state of Israel in biblical times. However, over the years, our families have blended with many other families, and we have today many interfaith families who have multiple faiths in their homes, and we have many people who converted to Judaism over the years. And so we can't say that all of the Jewish people can link themselves back to the geography, the location of Israel, but what we do believe above all else is that all Jewish people are Jewish and therefore connected to our tradition. And so what we like to say is No matter how you became Jewish, whether you were born Jewish, whether you converted to being Jewish, we like to say, just like I mentioned earlier in our service, about life being a parallel to the story of our Torah, we say we were all at Sinai, meaning that we were all at Mount Sinai. All of us, all of our souls, all of us present in some way, no matter how we became a part of this people, that we were all there at the moment that the Torah was given to the Jewish people, and that we began to have these obligations that we call commandments as our guide on how to live our life. Those were the questions that you submitted. They were wonderful, wonderful questions. We're sorry that we can't be here together. Normally what we offer, in addition to lots of donuts at the end of our service, is the opportunity to ask more questions after the service is over. So I want to make this offer to you. If you have other questions, please email me, rabbibrown@templeisraelakron.org. You can find that. You can connect through our website if you would like as well. And I will do my best to get back to you and answer any questions that you have now that you've been a part of our service. We thank you for all of the questions that you submitted and for allowing us to still have this special Shabbat that we enjoy so much. We're going to begin to conclude our service now as we turn to the prayers for healing and our prayers to offer comfort to those who've lost loved ones. As we begin to close our service, you can join us again in our prayer book, page 200.